Hey, what is going on here? Stop that right now. Break it up, now!
The clang of the metal door echoed down the corridor like the last note of a life being sealed away. Nina flinched at the sound. It wasn't just the noise. It was what it meant. That sound was her sentence taking shape, the physical manifestation of every mistake that had led her here. She was 45, but the fluorescent lights made her look older. The reflection in the small pane of reinforced glass didn't look like the woman she remembered, a teacher, a mother, a wife. Now, in the orange uniform that fit no one but belonged to everyone, she looked like a ghost haunting her own story. The officer leading her didn't speak. None of them ever did, not beyond orders. Cell block C, room 12. That was all. The rest was silence. Cold, indifferent silence, filled only with the rhythmic echo of boots on concrete. When the door slid open, Nina saw her new world. A narrow cell, 2 bunks, a small sink, the faint smell of bleach and loneliness, and another woman sitting on the lower bunk, reading a book so worn its cover had long since faded. The woman looked up. Gray hair cut neatly just below the ear, eyes a shade between blue and steel. She didn't seem surprised. She'd seen hundreds come and go. "New?" she asked, voice low and steady. Nina nodded. "Nina." The woman gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Vida." No handshake, no warmth, just acknowledgement. It was enough. Vida went back to her book. Nina stood awkwardly, unsure where to place her hands, her body, her shame. Every sound outside, the clank of trays, the distant shouting, the metallic laughter of locks, felt amplified inside her skull. When lights dimmed for the night, Nina lay on the upper bunk staring at the ceiling, counting cracks like constellations of regret. She tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Somewhere below her, Vida turned a page. Morning came without sunrise, just the buzz of fluorescent lights snapping awake. They were her new dawns now. The women filed into the cafeteria, trays in hand, eyes on the floor. Nina hesitated, lost in the unspoken rules of this new world. Where to sit, who to avoid, when to speak, when to stay invisible. Vida appeared beside her without a word and handed her a cup of water. "You'll want to stay hydrated," she said softly. "The air here dries you out." Nina took it, surprised by the kindness. "Thank you." Vida gave no reply. She simply walked to a corner table, her movements calm, precise, deliberate. All around, laughter rose from some tables, sharp and cruel. Others were silent. The guards watched everything with that detached look of people who'd seen too much to care. For the first time since she arrived, Nina's hands stopped shaking. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the calm in Vida's voice, or the way the older woman carried herself, not broken, not bitter, just still. That night, in their cell, Nina whispered into the dark. "How long have you been here?" Vida didn't look up from her book. 15 years. The words hit harder than any sentence could. 15 years of this. 15 years of days that all looked the same. "Do you ever get used to it?" Vida closed the book, looked straight into Nina's eyes. "No. You just learn which parts of yourself to turn off." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid, of lives before, of everything they'd lost. That night, Nina couldn't sleep. She turned on her side, staring at Vida's silhouette in the dim light seeping through the bars. The woman seemed carved out of stone, solid, unbreakable, but her breathing was soft, almost peaceful. Nina realized something strange. For the first time since her arrest, she didn't feel entirely alone. The walls were still there, the bars, the uniform, the rules. But in that small, sterile room, a single thread of warmth had begun to form. Fragile, almost invisible, yet undeniable. She didn't know it yet, but that thread would soon become the only thing strong enough to break every wall around her heart. Days turned into weeks, each one identical to the last, measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the echoes of footsteps, the clang of doors, and the way the light slanted through the narrow slit of the cell window. Nina learned the rhythm of the place. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work duty, lunch, roll call, silence. Everything was predictable except the people. Some women shouted just to prove they still had a voice. Others withdrew into themselves until they were barely human shadows. Vida was neither. She moved through the days like water through stone, silent, shaping the world around her in ways no one noticed but everyone felt. At first, Nina thought Vida was simply indifferent, but slowly she began to see the quiet ways Vida took care of others, slipping an extra piece of bread onto a tray, fixing a broken button for an older inmate, cleaning a spill before the guards could shout. She did it all without expecting thanks, without even looking up. When Nina once asked her why, Vida replied, "Because kindness is the only thing they can't confiscate." The two began to share the smallest parts of life. A folded corner in a borrowed book, a whispered joke about the watery soup, the sound of their breaths in the dark. There was no need for more. Words could be dangerous in a place where everything was overheard. Connection lived in gestures, in the brush of an arm, in a glance that lingered half a second too long. One afternoon, while scrubbing floors in the hallway, Nina noticed Vida slow down. Her knees trembled slightly, the mop handle shaking in her hand. Without thinking, Nina reached out and steadied her. Vida's eyes met hers for an instant, an unguarded, human instant, and Nina saw it clearly for the first time. Beneath the steel and silence, Vida was tired. Not just physically, but deeply, soulfully tired. That night, rain began to fall. In the dim cell light, the drops drew faint patterns on the concrete outside, and the smell of wet earth drifted through the bars. Nina couldn't sleep. She turned toward the lower bunk and whispered, "Tell me something from before." Vida was quiet for so long Nina thought she wouldn't answer. Then softly she said, "Before, I had a garden, just a small one. Tomatoes, lavender, and a rose bush that refused to die. Every morning I'd water it and pretend that was enough to keep the world from falling apart." Nina smiled faintly in the dark. "What happened to it?" "The garden?" Vida exhaled slowly. "It died the day I came here. They didn't speak again for the rest of the night. But in the hush between the raindrops, something wordless passed between them. An understanding that life had once been full of color and scent and sound, and that maybe, somewhere inside, it still was." Over the following days, Nina began to change. The nervous tremor in her hands faded. She stopped jumping at every sound. When other inmates mocked her softness, she no longer lowered her eyes. There was strength in her now, not the kind that fought, but the kind that endured. She knew it came from Vida. During mealtime, a younger prisoner shoved Nina in line, spilling her tray. The cafeteria froze. Vida stepped forward, her voice steady and quiet. "Pick it up." The girl hesitated, then did as told. No one laughed. No one challenged her. When it was over, Nina sat down beside Vida, heart racing. "You didn't have to do that." Vida tore a piece of bread in half and pushed it toward her. "I know," she said simply, "but I wanted to." The guards began to notice the way they gravitated toward each other, the way their silences seemed to synchronize. It was harmless for now, but everything in prison had a limit. Friendship could be tolerated. Anything beyond that could not. Yet neither woman spoke of it. They didn't need to. One night, the wind outside howled like the memory of freedom. Nina lay awake, staring at the faint outline of Vida below. The older woman's breathing was slow, even. Nina felt a strange ache rise in her chest. Not desire exactly, but something deeper. Something that terrified her because it felt like being alive again. In the darkness, she whispered, almost to herself, "Do you ever forget what freedom feels like?" Vida didn't move. Her voice came quiet, almost fragile. "I stopped trying to remember. Now I just find pieces of it where I can." Nina lay there long after, eyes open to the ceiling, heart trembling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Maybe this was what freedom was now. Not a place beyond walls, but a moment, a connection, a breath shared in the dark. And though she couldn't see it, Vida was awake too, staring into the same darkness, feeling the same impossible thing bloom quietly between them, something neither the guards nor the walls could ever contain. The next morning, the air in the cafeteria felt thicker than usual, heavy with the stench of disinfectant and tension. Conversations were low and cautious, eyes shifting toward the guards at every movement. Nina sat across from Vida, picking at the tasteless oatmeal, pretending not to notice the way the room seemed to hold its breath around them. A new inmate had arrived the night before, a young woman with quick hands and a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. Trouble. Everyone could sense it. When the girl brushed past Nina's table, her tray accidentally knocked into Nina's arm, spilling the bowl onto the floor. The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, echoing too loud for such a small act. Nina froze. Before she could say anything, Vida rose slowly from her seat. Her tone was quiet, but her words sliced through the noise. "Pick it up." The cafeteria went still. Even the guards paused. The young woman sneered, opening her mouth to answer, but something in Vida's gaze stopped her cold. She bent down, picked up the bowl, and placed it back on the tray. Vida didn't move until the girl turned away. Then she sat back down, calm as before. Nina couldn't speak for a long moment. Finally, she whispered, "Why would you do that?" Vida's eyes didn't leave her tray. "Because if you don't draw a line, someone else will decide where you stand." Later that day, when the two worked together in the laundry room, Nina watched Vida's hands, steady, methodical, folding the endless orange uniforms as if the act itself held meaning. "You've been here so long," Nina said quietly. "You still care about lines?" Vida gave a half smile. "Lines keep us from disappearing. Even in here." She looked up then, and her eyes softened. "Especially in here." Something inside Nina cracked open at that. The words stayed with her long after the day ended, echoing in her chest like a heartbeat. That night, she couldn't sleep again. The sound of distant thunder rolled through the walls, a low growl that made the bars hum faintly. Vida was awake too, reading by the weak glow of the corridor light. "You never sleep much, do you?" Nina asked. Vida looked up, her face caught between shadow and silver light. "Sleep makes the nights longer." There was a pause, the kind that stretched until it hurt. Nina sat up on the top bunk, knees drawn to her chest. "I used to think I was strong," she murmured. "Out there, I had everything planned, everything under control. Then one mistake and it all fell apart." Vida closed the book and rested it on her lap. "That's the thing about control," she said. "You only realize it was an illusion when it's gone." Nina smiled faintly. "And you? Were you ever in control?" Vida met her eyes for a moment, then looked away. "Once," she said softly, "but it cost me too much. The storm outside broke then, rain lashing against the bars, wind whistling through the cracks. The sound filled the cell like a heartbeat made of sky. For a long time they just listened." Nina found herself watching the way the raindrops slid down the metal bars, like tears that refused to fall. "Tell me something," Nina said suddenly. "If you could go anywhere right now, where would it be?" Vida thought for a long moment. "Nowhere," she said at last. "I don't dream of places anymore. Just moments." "What kind of moments?" Vida's voice dropped to a whisper. "Ones that don't vanish when you wake up." Something in the way she said it made Nina's chest tighten. She climbed down from the bunk, barefoot on the cold floor, and sat beside Vida on the lower bed. Neither of them spoke. The storm outside raged, but inside the small cell, time seemed to hold its breath. Vida's hand rested on the blanket between them, fingers still. Nina's hand trembled as it reached out, not touching, just hovering close enough to feel the warmth. Vida didn't move away. The space between their hands became a quiet confession. When the lights flickered and the thunder rolled again, Vida turned her head slightly, her voice barely audible. "Be careful, Nina. This place takes everything if you let it." "I know," Nina whispered back. "But maybe it doesn't have to take this." For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The walls, the guards, the endless routines, none of it mattered. There was only the soft rhythm of rain, the faint heat between two hands that hadn't touched in years, and the fragile miracle of feeling something human in a place designed to destroy it. When morning came, the storm had passed. The cell smelled of damp air and metal. Vida was already awake, sitting by the bars, her eyes lost in the pale blue dawn. Nina lay there watching her, a quiet certainty blooming inside her chest. The walls were still there, yes, but they no longer held her heart prisoner. The following days passed in a quiet, dangerous kind of peace, the kind that felt borrowed, like sunlight sneaking through the bars. Nina and Vida worked together on cleaning duty, side by side, their movements synchronized by routine and something unspoken. The guards rarely spoke to them anymore. They had learned that these two women caused no trouble, drew no attention. But in a place where everything was monitored, silence could be its own rebellion. Each morning began the same: the buzz of lights, the scrape of boots, breakfast trays sliding across the counter. Yet for Nina, something had shifted. The monotony that once suffocated her now held a strange kind of rhythm. When Vida walked beside her, even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt less hostile. She caught herself looking forward to their tasks, the shared mop bucket, the quiet moments in the hallway where no one else passed, the sound of Vida's steady breathing beside her. One afternoon, while scrubbing the floor near the west wing, Nina cut her palm on a rusted nail. The blood surprised her, a vivid, defiant color in this world of gray. She hissed under her breath, but before she could move, Vida was there. "Let me see," she said. Her voice carried authority, the kind that made people obey without thinking. She tore a strip from the inside hem of her uniform and wrapped it around Nina's hand, tight but gentle. Their eyes met for a second that felt longer than it should. "You didn't have to do that," Nina said softly. Vida tied the knot and met her gaze. "I know, but I don't like seeing people bleed." Nina tried to smile. "Old nurse's habit." Vida nodded once. "Old habit of trying to fix things I can't." For the rest of the day, Nina couldn't stop thinking about the feel of Vida's hands, rough from work, but careful, almost tender. It had been years since anyone had touched her without anger or pity. That night, when she removed the makeshift bandage, She found herself folding the torn fabric carefully, as if it were something sacred. The connection between them deepened, but so did the danger. There were rules here, written and unwritten. Guards watched for anything that resembled closeness. Some inmates traded affection for protection or favors, but what Nina and Vida had was different. It wasn't built on desperation, but on recognition. Two souls who had seen too much, who found in each other the only piece of gentleness left in the world. One evening during head count, a guard stopped in front of their cell longer than usual. His eyes lingered on them, suspicion flickering like static. "You two getting cozy, huh?" he said, half mocking, half warning. Vida didn't react. She stood still, her face calm, unreadable. Nina lowered her gaze. The guard snorted, smirked, and moved on. But the air in the cell that night felt tighter, like the walls were listening. When the lights went out, neither of them spoke for a long time. Then, from below, Vida's voice came, quiet as the dark. "You can't let them see it." "See what?" Nina whispered. Vida hesitated. "Hope?" The word lingered in the air like a fragile secret. But hope was already there, blooming in silence. Nina felt it every time Vida brushed past her shoulder, every time their eyes met across the yard. It wasn't loud or reckless. It was steady, defiant, alive. It was the kind of hope that survived because it refused to name itself. Weeks later, during evening exercise, a fight broke out near the fence. Loud, chaotic, the kind of violence that spread like fire. Guards rushed in, shouting, batons raised. In the confusion, someone shoved Nina to the ground. The world spun. A boot came down dangerously close to her head. Then, hands. Vida's hands, pulling her up, shielding her with her body, taking the blow meant for her. The moment was over in seconds, but the sight of blood on Vida's temple burned into Nina's mind like a brand. When the guards dragged them apart, she shouted her name until her voice broke. Hours later, Vida returned to the cell, her face pale but intact. A small cut ran along her hairline, and her uniform was torn at the shoulder. Nina ran to her before she could stop herself. "Why did you do that?" Vida sank onto the bunk, eyes distant. "Because I couldn't let them hurt you." Nina knelt beside her, trembling. "You could have been sent to isolation." "I've been there before," Vida said quietly. "But if they took you away, I don't think I'd survive it this time." The words hung between them, raw and irreversible. The room seemed to shrink around their breathing. Without thinking, Nina reached out, brushed a strand of hair from Vida's face. Vida caught her hand gently, held it there. Neither spoke. The hum of the lights faded, the world outside their cell dissolved, and for one suspended heartbeat, the walls lost their meaning. When Vida finally released her, she whispered, "Be careful. They watch everything." Nina's voice trembled. "Then we'll just give them nothing to see." That night, when the lights dimmed, Nina couldn't sleep. She lay on the top bunk, listening to Vida's breathing below. Her heart beat with something she hadn't felt in years, fear and joy, grief and longing, tangled together into one unbearable, beautiful thing. The walls still stood. The rules hadn't changed. But somewhere inside that cage, two hearts had begun to beat in secret, in rhythm, beyond the reach of iron or eyes or time itself. Days blurred into each other again, but something inside Nina refused to fade back into the rhythm of captivity. The world around her remained gray and cold, but every time she caught Vida's gaze, she felt something subtle, like the faint pulse of color beneath frost. They rarely spoke now, not out of fear but necessity. The guards were watching more closely since the fight, and gossip had begun to spread among the other inmates. Still, when their eyes met across the cafeteria or while folding sheets in the laundry, it was enough. The silence between them had become a language only they understood. One evening, the warden ordered a surprise inspection. The guards stormed through the cells, throwing open lockers, tearing sheets, overturning mattresses. When they reached Nina and Vita's cell, one of them found the small scrap of fabric Nina had kept hidden, the torn piece of Vita's uniform she'd saved since the day of her cut hand. The guard lifted it between 2 fingers, smirking. "What's this? Souvenir?" Nina's stomach dropped, but before she could answer, Vita stepped forward. "Mine," she said evenly. "It tore during work duty. I told her to keep it for patching." The guard raised an eyebrow, amused but unconvinced. "Sure, whatever you say, Grandma." He threw the fabric on the floor and left. The door slammed behind them. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Nina whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." "If they'd thought you were lying," Vita interrupted, her voice calm. "I've lied before, Nina. I know how to survive." Nina looked at her, at the faint bruise still fading near her temple, and felt her throat tighten. "You shouldn't always have to." Vita smiled faintly. "In here, we all have to." That night, something in Nina broke quietly. She sat on the lower bunk beside Vita, their knees almost touching. "You keep saving me," she said softly. "I don't even know why." Vita closed her book, her fingers lingering on the page. "Because you still look at this place like it hasn't beaten you yet. You remind me of something I thought was gone." "What's that?" "Light." Nina swallowed hard. She wanted to speak, to tell Vita that she had become her light too, that every moment beside her made this unbearable place feel almost human again, but the words refused to come. So instead she reached out, trembling, and brushed her fingertips against Vita's hand. Vita didn't pull away. The touch was small, almost nothing, yet it felt infinite. For a while, they sat that way, the silence soft around them. Outside, the floodlights hummed, painting thin stripes of white across the concrete floor. The bars cast long shadows that divided the light into squares, like fragments of a broken window. "Do you ever think about after?" Nina asked finally. Vita's eyes lifted, uncertain. "After?" "After this, when you're free." Vita was quiet for a long time. "I used to. I stopped. There's no point dreaming about doors that don't open." Nina hesitated. "Maybe not. But someday one of us will walk out, and if it's me first, I'll wait for you." Vita turned to her then, her expression unreadable, her eyes searching Nina's face as if trying to decide whether to believe her. "Don't," she said gently. "Freedom doesn't wait for people like us." Nina shook her head. "Then maybe it should." The words hung between them like a vow neither of them dared to name. Weeks passed. Their closeness deepened, but so did the tension around them. One morning, Vita was called into the infirmary for extra duty. She didn't return until late evening, her hands trembling slightly, her uniform stained with blood that wasn't hers. "What happened?" Nina whispered. "Fight in D block," Vita murmured, washing her hands in the small sink. "They brought in a girl with a broken jaw. I stitched her up." "Are you okay?" Vita nodded, drying her hands. "You stop feeling things after a while." But Nina saw the faint tremor that contradicted the words. Without thinking, she reached out and held Vita's wrist, her thumb brushing over a small cut near her vein. Vita looked at her hand, then at her face, and something gave way. In that instant, the distance they'd built to survive collapsed. Vita leaned forward, her forehead resting lightly against Nina's. The contact was tender, fleeting, but it carried the weight of everything they couldn't say aloud. "I don't know what this is anymore," Vita whispered. "It's the only real thing left," Nina said. Vita's eyes closed, and a single tear escaped, trailing down her cheek. Nina caught it with her thumb, then pressed her lips softly against her temple. A kiss that felt like both confession and surrender. When they finally parted, Vida whispered, "They'll destroy us if they find out." Nina shook her head. "Then we'll let them try." For the first time in years, Vida smiled. A small, broken, beautiful smile that reached all the way to her tired eyes. That night, Nina fell asleep on the lower bunk beside her. The walls were still there, the locks, the endless routines, but the silence had changed. It no longer felt empty. It hummed with something alive. And as Vida drifted into sleep, she thought, not for the first time, but for the first time in years, that maybe love wasn't freedom's opposite. Maybe it was the only kind of freedom they were ever meant to have. The following morning, the routine returned as if nothing had changed. The same metallic clang of doors, the same whistle cutting through the corridor, the same tired faces lining up for breakfast. But for Nina, everything was different now. Every sound, every step, every breath seemed to carry a secret rhythm, one that pulsed quietly between her and Vida. They didn't speak, didn't glance at each other for too long, yet every movement was charged with the memory of last night. It lived beneath the surface like a pulse under skin, hidden but impossible to ignore. Days slipped by in that quiet tension, the kind that made ordinary things feel sacred. When Vida brushed against her arm while passing a tray, Nina's heart raced. When Nina laughed at something one of the other women said, Vida's eyes softened, just for a moment. Neither of them dared to name what they had, but it was there, constant, breathing quietly between them. Then one afternoon, during roll call in the yard, a fight broke out near the fence, violent, sudden, like an explosion of chaos. Two women were screaming, fists flying, guards rushing in with batons raised. The crowd scattered in panic, and Nina stumbled backward into the fray. She didn't even see the guard's arm coming until it swung wide, the baton flashing toward her face. And then, Vida was there. She caught Nina by the shoulders and shoved her out of the way, taking the blow across her ribs. The sound of it was sickening, a hollow crack followed by a gasp that didn't sound like Vida at all. The guards barked orders, the crowd was forced to the ground, and by the time Nina looked up, Vida was already being dragged away, her hands cuffed behind her back. "Vida!" Nina screamed, but the guard shoved her down. "Stay down or you'll join her!" The rest of the day blurred into fragments. The noise of closing gates, the smell of antiseptic, the emptiness of their cell without her. When night came, Nina sat alone on the lower bunk, staring at Vida's book still lying open, the page marked by a single folded corner. She wasn't allowed to see her for 3 days. Vida had been sent to isolation. Every hour stretched endlessly, a void where the world had no sound. Nina tried to eat, to sleep, to move, but every thought circled back to the same image. Vida's face disappearing behind the steel door, the echo of her name still trembling in the air. On the 4th night, the door finally opened. The guards pushed Vida back into the cell without a word. She looked smaller somehow, her hair damp from the shower, her eyes dark and hollow. Nina stood frozen for a moment, then rushed forward. "Vida," she whispered, her voice breaking. Vida gave a tired smile, the kind that hurt to see. "You should sleep. You look worse than me." But when Nina reached out, she flinched. Not from fear, but from pain. The bruise along her ribs was dark and spreading, visible even under the thin fabric of her uniform. "They hurt you," Nina said, her voice trembling. Vida's expression didn't change. "They hurt everyone. That's their job." Nina knelt down, her hands shaking. "Let me see." Vida hesitated, then sighed. "You won't like it." "I don't care." Slowly, Vida lifted the edge of her shirt. The bruises bloomed across her skin, violet, black, fading into yellow near the edges. Nina's breath caught. Without thinking, she touched the mark with her fingertips, barely grazing it. Vida winced, but didn't move away. "I'm sorry," Nina whispered. "For what?" "For all of it. For being the reason you got hurt." Vida's hand found hers, resting gently against her wrist. "You're not the reason," she said softly. "This place is." They sat there for a long time, neither speaking, their hands still joined. The hum of the fluorescent light above filled the silence like a lullaby no one wanted to end. Finally, Vida leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed. "You shouldn't care so much about me, Nina. It'll only make things harder." Nina shook her head. "It already is, but I don't care." Vida opened her eyes then, studying her face as if searching for something she'd lost long ago. "You're different," she said quietly. "You still believe in people." Nina gave a faint, broken laugh. "Only one person right now." Vida's lips parted slightly as if to protest, but the words never came. Instead, she reached out, touched Nina's cheek, and let her hand linger there. The gesture was small, almost nothing. And yet it was everything. That night, Nina slept on the floor beside Vida's bunk, refusing to leave her side. The light flickered overhead, and in the brief moments of darkness, Vida's hand would brush against hers, as if to make sure she was still there. Days later, word spread that Vida's behavior in the yard had been reported as heroic. It wasn't official, but the guards had started leaving them alone. The tension around them eased just slightly. One evening, while the others played cards or whispered in corners, Nina and Vida sat by the cell window, the sky fading to bruised purple beyond the bars. "Do you ever think," Nina said softly, "that maybe we weren't meant to meet anywhere else but here?" Vida looked at her, brow furrowed. "That's a strange thought." "I know, but maybe this is the only place small enough for something like this to fit. Out there, it would have drowned in all the noise." Vida smiled faintly, turning back to the light slipping through the bars. "Maybe," she murmured. "Or maybe it's the only place quiet enough for us to hear it." The evening bell rang, echoing down the corridor. The world outside continued as always, cold, unfeeling, endless. But in that narrow space of concrete and steel, two women sat side by side, sharing the last sliver of twilight like a promise neither of them could speak. And though the night swallowed everything after, their hearts, for the first time in years, beat without fear. Weeks passed. The prison settled into its strange rhythm again, the shuffle of feet on concrete, the clang of metal doors, the bark of guards echoing off the walls. Yet for Nina and Vida, something had changed forever. What once was survival had become connection. What once was numbness had turned to feeling. It wasn't spoken of, but it lived in the space between them, in the quiet, in the way their shoulders brushed, in the way a shared glance could slow time. The others had begun to notice. Whispers followed them now, drifting through the air like dust. "They're close," some said with amusement. Others said it like a threat. But no one dared confront Vida. Her calm was a kind of authority earned through years of endurance. Still, Nina worried. Every day felt like walking a narrow bridge over a bottomless pit. Then one morning, a guard stopped outside their cell longer than usual. He was new, younger, crueler, eager to prove himself. His gaze lingered too long, and his smirk was too familiar. "You two getting friendly in there?" he said, tapping the bars with his baton. "Careful. We don't like when people forget where they are." Vida looked up from her book, her tone steady but sharp. "We remember just fine." The guard stared for a moment, then walked away, laughter trailing behind him. Nina's hands trembled long after the sound faded. Vida closed her book slowly and looked up at her. "Don't give him fear," she said quietly. "It's what he's looking for. That night, sleep didn't come." Nina lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the bars slicing the dim light into patterns that danced like ghosts. "Do you ever wish you'd just forgotten how to feel?" she asked softly. Vida's voice came from below, calm, heavy with fatigue. "Sometimes. But then I remember. Forgetting's just another kind of dying." Nina turned her head toward the edge of the bunk. "And loving? What's that?" Vida hesitated. "The part of us they can't kill." The next day, word spread that a parole hearing had been approved for Nina. It came unexpectedly, like a blow she didn't know how to absorb. Freedom, the very thing she had dreamed of for so long, now felt like betrayal. That evening, she sat motionless on the lower bunk. Vida was sewing a tear in her sleeve, her fingers moving with patient precision. "You should be happy," she said without looking up. "I don't know how to be," Nina whispered. "Not without you." Vida stopped sewing. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Vida placed the needle down and leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "You'll go," she said softly, "and you'll live. That's the point of surviving this place. So at least one of us remembers what it's like to be alive." Nina shook her head, tears building in her eyes. "You don't understand. You're the only thing that's kept me alive." Vida looked at her, eyes glistening but steady. "Then don't waste what I gave you." The days leading up to Nina's release passed in slow agony. Every sound, every meal, every sunrise through the bars felt like the last of something sacred. The night before she was due to leave, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the floor beside Vida's bunk, her hand resting lightly on the older woman's knee. "I'm scared," she said. Vida looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair from Nina's face. "Freedom's always scary. You forget how to breathe out there." "Will you wait for me?" Nina asked, voice trembling. Vida smiled faintly. "I'll be right here." Same sky, different walls. When dawn came, Nina stood by the cell door as it opened. Vida pressed something small into her hand, a strip of orange fabric, frayed but neatly folded. "So you don't forget," she said simply. Nina wanted to say everything she couldn't. "I love you. I'll come back. Don't let them take your light." But the words got lost in her throat. She reached out instead, fingers brushing Vida's cheek. For one stolen heartbeat, the world outside didn't exist. Then the guard's voice broke through. "Time to go!" Nina stepped out of the cell. Vida watched her leave, her face calm, her hands folded around the empty air where Nina's warmth had been. As the heavy door shut, the clang echoed down the hall, the same sound that had marked the beginning of Nina's sentence. But this time, it wasn't an ending. It was a promise. Outside, the morning light was pale and sharp, stinging her eyes. Nina stood still, feeling the wind for the first time in years. In her hand, the piece of orange cloth fluttered like a tiny flag, the color of captivity, and somehow the color of love. And somewhere behind the walls, Vida sat on the lower bunk, tracing the edge of the missing hem on her sleeve, her lips moving silently, not in prayer, but in memory. For both of them, the prison remained. But so did something stronger, something the walls could never hold.